thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm a kind of a part-time Japan studies or hobby Japan studies person, so really my interests are in comparative analysis, and Japan's been a kind of on and off case. I've been a little bit more off Japan, but recently working, so it was a kind of good timing to be invited. So yeah, I'm going to talk about sustainability, I mean, kind of from a certain angle, looking at the corporate sector and kind of under the label of corporate social responsibility, which, you know, these days we might talk about ESG or sustainability. So I'm kind of referring here to an academic discourse on CSR as a topic, but I mean very much the environmental dimension. So I'll try to pull that out a little bit, but I'll talk more broadly. And yeah, I mean, the challenge of sustainability coming from a kind of comparative political economy perspective, I mean, it's really been a kind of discussion like the varieties of capitalism or these kind of literature that's not addressed climate change and climate crisis and so forth. And you kind of think, well, didn't I know back when I was a student, everybody knew that the rainforest was disappearing at, you know, a football field a second or something like this, and now, you know, it still is, and we kind of somehow, I don't know what happened in the meantime, but it's really been you know, the people working on climate have not always like linked up to the mainstream of people working in the field. So, you know, my kind of current interest just is to kind of like change that discussion a little bit, and working now on a special issue with a colleague Bazak Kus on greening the economy, trying to like reframe political economy around these issues. And today I'll give a kind of thin slice of that around the topic of CSR. So in the time allowed, I'll do my best to give you a little introduction for the non-specialist to what's CSR and the kind of theoretical thinking, and then I'll present you know, basically try to give you a kind of quantitative picture about where Japan stands in relation to other countries, and then in the second part, zoom in a little bit with some, it's a little bit mostly older research that was done before Corona. We had a big project from the EU on Japan on institutional change, and we did a lot of interviews together with my former PhD student, now professor at Radboud University, Julia Bartosz, with CEOs and CSR specialists in Japanese companies. So we'll try to give a little bit of like qualitative insight on what's going on. And so, some of the research, if you're very interested in the corporate governance Japan, hopefully will be coming out soon in a book from my colleagues at Waseda on corporate governance in Japan, which will be forthcoming in a few months. So without further ado, let me introduce a bit the CSR issue. And this always frustrates my students. I say, well, they say, what's CSR? I say, well, it's a social construction. It's a contested concept. But there's a reason to say that, because there's not really a kind of, you know, agreement about, well, what responsibilities should companies meet? You know, it's kind of as a normative concept, and people have different ideas about exactly what those responsibilities are. So as a scholar, you kind of want to stand back from that and kind of study the social process by which, you know, actors in reality kind of construct that. It's a source of contestation and conflict that takes place, you know, there's like the shadow of rules and regulations. That's important context. But then you involve like other stakeholders at the company level that then kind of like pick up, implement, or also avoid, or we'll talk a little bit maybe about, you kind of didn't use the word, but alluded to maybe greenwashing, as the topic said, it becomes a normal marketing thing. So, the other interesting thing, if we look in this way, is to say, well, like not just the extent of responsibility, but like the qualitative, like the way of thinking about responsibility or the way of putting it into practice could differ quite a lot in different societies, right? And so we'll kind of try to come back to that in a kind of probably leading kind of theoretical article on that. Was talked about. I'm not always such a fan of the terminology, but it's very established in the field, but like an implicit CSR or explicit CSR, but the idea that CSR is somehow more kind of built into the institutions, like in Germany, well, we have like a health insurance system, and companies, implement that as part of just like compliance with regulation. In the US, having health insurance at your job was kind of like a big extra that you get from the corporation. So this was their kind of idea of like the way the same kind of provision of health might be organized in different ways, and it's more kind of implicit. And we'll kind of try to understand if that's the case in Japan. And in my previous work doing kind of like broad cross-national comparisons, we kind of came up with like two, well, they're not actually contradictory, but seemingly paradoxical drivers of CSR, right? And one kind of stream of research or support we can find, the idea that CSR emerges kind of as a substitute for more formal regulatory institutions. So, a company maybe does business in a place where there's not, say, strong human rights or strong environmental regulations. Customers back home say, well, if you're doing there, what are you caring about the environment? And companies sort of show their responsibility by adopting like private governance that kind of, in some sense, is voluntary and is kind of aiming to like substitute for those like formal institutions and create legitimacy around stakeholder issues. And companies often use that. It was kind of also alluded to, like, give them, like, we in the literature talk about the business case for CSR. The idea, well, if I'm more green than you, my product's more environmental, my plastic bottle is even more recyclable or whatever, right? That this can, like, differentiate your products and services and kind of, like, can be create, like, a win-win scenario for the business sector, when you kind of align with SDGs. So it's not like out of the goodness of your heart kind of motivation, but it's a very kind of instrumental motivation, but it recognizes, well, these are important issues to address, and by being kind of like a leader in those win-win solutions, it's actually like makes good business sense, right? And so in this view, like, corporations are kind of out ahead of regulators, so they're trying to like do more or fill in where regulation is absent, right? Because if you have like a mandatory law, right, let's say all bottles have to be 100% recycled, well, it doesn't help you differentiate your products anymore if you're just complying with that, right? So in some senses, you always have to be a little bit ahead. And so that could mean corporate sector is really important and really driver and making innovations and so forth. And we've found some kind of evidence of that, but equally you can find other evidence that points to the kind of opposite story, and that corporations maybe tend to kind of not really take on a lot of responsibilities where it's not an easy win-win, and therefore when you find more responsibility really as something that more mirrors the kind of broader regulatory environment and kind of extends from governance, which is either done in kind of Europe in the kind of corporatist settings like trade unions and employers associations, or the sort of the kind of fashionable term in the literature is like orchestrated by the state. I think the Japanese state is kind of an orchestrator. They kind of campaign a lot and kind of try to convince business rather than regulating so much. But then, the kind of strength of CSR kind of extends from the kind of inclusion and participation of stakeholders in the polity in civil society, and kind of extends outward from that. And it's really more about like being a good citizen, doing things in the public interest, and kind of collaborating with stakeholders. And the kind of interesting thing is there's kind of quantitative evidence for both of these like mechanisms or drivers, even though they're seemingly opposite, because they kind of seem to predict that, CSR will be high in both more sort of so-called like liberal market economies, like the United States, and coordinated market economies like Japan is usually put in that category. So we might expect that this kind of mirroring mechanism to work in Japan. And just to kind of preview my argument and hopefully be a little bit provocative, Japan's not very high on CSR, and neither of these arguments apply very well, right? So I'll try to kind of like be a little bit, see what all of you think of this idea. So I'll just try to be fairly quick, but I have a few kind of background, where CSR comes from, and so why should corporations, say, even care about environment, and we'll go really speedy through these. They're pretty familiar, but the kind of classic idea in economic theory was, of course, that corporations need not care too much about the environment. They maximize returns to shareholders and are really, the kind of studies about that. There was always kind of a counter theory, which it's really kind of family of theories. I would call stakeholder theory. It's not really a unified theory in the way agency theory is, but basically saying it's not just the shareholders that matter. Corporations affect other parties that are kind of are at risk from corporate actions, and therefore kind of if you're at risk, you should kind of have a say in what corporations do, or at least be able to install like the idea that managers have like a duty to the environment or to the particular stakeholders. And this is kind of these days people talk a lot about kind of corporate purpose, the idea, well, corporations would be like a foundation that have some kind of higher purpose, right? So this is kind of lots of different stakeholder theories around. And interesting thing as you get a little bit older, super old, but a little bit older, that you see that the paradigms, the way of thinking changes a lot over time. So when I was a high school student and entered university, it was very much the time of Wall Street and kind of idea the US was kind of ending the Thatcherian years. It was a time actually when the Japanese economy was still in fashion as a kind of stakeholder alternative. As I kind of started doing my PhD in the 90s, it kind of flipped around and it became, okay, the rise of venture capital superiority of the US model, and Japan seemed to be a little bit like, oh, it's too rigid and they're caring too much about their stakeholders and not reforming their economy. Then in the 2000s, this kind of flipped again in the sense of like the idea of like pursuit of shareholder value kind of lost its like complete hegemony. People say, well, there can be something like, too much shareholder value, or Michael Jensen, the famous financial economist, said like, just say no to Wall Street. And this was kind of at a time where Japan was kind of just like thinking about adopting this model, which I would just say kind of like had been kind of discredited to some extent. And we kind of arrive at something like, the kind of contemporary situation, which is a little bit neither here or there. Like we're all kind of a little bit stakeholder theorists these days, because people tend to think that, taking care of the environment is like, whether or not it's ethically important, it's kind of like good business sense, and that, really there's not much difference between being responsible and doing good business. So we're kind of at a tendency where, in some sense, there's a kind of broad agreement, or like kind of ideological war seems to have ended. But, I don't know, have we really found the model of doing this? There's a lot of kind of skepticism now around CSR and so forth. So this is kind of context in which, Japan kind of emerges. I won't go through all. I'm going to kind of skip through some slides, but we kind of think of Japan broadly as belonging to the stakeholder model. Why? We had fairly long-term corporate ownership. We had very stable kind of insider boards, long-term employment. The idea was that Japanese corporations, they could take the long view, which sounds really good for the environment, right? Like we want to think in the long term, and not just be worried about our quarterly earnings and cutting corners on environmental issues. So there seemed to be like a lot of potential. Okay, Japan should really be like well positioned to be like, the responsible company, to be like leaders in the environment. And if we go a little bit deeper in this issue, there's different kinds of ways of integrating stakeholders. I did a lot of comparative work of Germany and Japan, and the way of integrating, say, employees into the company is very different. And one of my mentors, Ronald Dorr, always talked about the Japanese, like the enterprise community, and the idea that, well, it's kind of like a relatively kind of homogeneous community of usually male, workers from come from the same university and so forth. So as we kind of look at the emergence of CSR, I should say in Japan now, because I'm talking about Japan, and I won't go through that, but there's kind of some early regulation on environment. and these things that kind of come a little bit from health and safety, a little bit from air pollution in the 70s and so forth. So it's a kind of like a phase one in which people were not really talking about CSR, but the state was kind of like regulating the most kind of egregious air pollution and water pollution, trying to clean up the natural environment a little bit. And there was a limited attempt to like make companies responsible for this by implementing the idea of companies like should disclose some information. But this is, the short story is like fairly weakly developed in this kind of phase one. And as you kind of get a recent public policy, CSR becomes something that's sort of being built into the kind of institutions of corporate governance, which were kind of designed really to make managers accountable to like shareholders, right? They're kind of designed in some way, and we have things like accounting and corporate reporting. And the kind of argument I want to make is that CSR kind of, it's just sort of like adding, it's like kind of piggybacking on this, these kind of dimensions and so forth. So you see that in the Companies Act in 2002 in Japan, there was like a little bit of weak requirements to disclose some information about, say, environmental activities. And then this was kind of built in these days to the Corporate Governance Code, which is a kind of also kind of hybrid kind of self-regulation instrument that basically sets out for like best practices and for like governance in general, but has now like including this element of ESG practices. You see that a bit with also like women's issues, which is not like our main environmental focus, but like promoting gender diversity as part of a CSR agenda, and kind of government task force on climate financial disclosure. So like there's kind of increasing pressure for companies to kind of produce more information about what they're doing on environmental and social issues. They kind of have culminated in the corporate disclosure law. And so we kind of think about this, Julie and I, about a kind of like explicitization, making more explicit these kind of like, maybe things that companies always did, but trying to articulate them, write them down in the company reports, make them more visible to investors, to outsiders, and so forth. And the idea here is that it's really part of simply like good governance or being like producing more value for shareholders, because the idea is that, well, if your company's not green enough, it's not the government who will come and kind of shut down your factory and punish you, but it's the idea that basically the market will kind of reward or sanction your green behavior based on what it considers valuable. And so forth. So this kind of whole idea, I would say, kind of institutionalizes the idea of CSR, really this more like business case idea, or the like liberal idea, or what I call substitution strategy, where companies kind of mostly voluntarily do these things to the extent that the market kind of supports and facilitates that, with the idea also implicitly that the government will kind of give to the market the power to sanction, and does not like really worrying about sanctioning itself too much, right? Okay, so the main kind of thing I'll then try to address is like, how does this like advent of CSR, these regulations and adoption of CSR practices, like changing like the kind of the kind of nature of Japanese companies, and so we'll try to look at that now by putting in the context, right? So in the paper, I'm happy to share this almost finished book chapter. There's a lot of, my colleagues are financial economists, so I spent a lot of time with company data, and I'll show you a few highlights on that, but I'm going to go through pretty rapid fire, but happy to kind of answer questions about it. So basically we try to kind of benchmark, well, how green are Japanese companies compared to other countries? Are they like leaders? Are they like laggards? Are they behind? There's a lot of different ways to measure that, and there's not a perfect data source to give a definitive one. We use a kind of very common measure from Refinitiv, some usually formally referred to as Asset 4. This data keeps getting bought by other companies that keep like giving the data different names and different databases and so forth. So you may see it, a lot of published papers use so-called Asset 4 data, but it's now called a Refinitiv. And basically, we try to look at the kind of scores for companies in OECD countries over a pretty long time period of 2002 to 2021. In the second part, I'll show some highlights from interviews that we did with some CEOs, corporate directors, and CSR staff. So the quantitative part, for non-experts, the CSR is now called ESG, and usually we have an environmental pillar, a social pillar, and a governance pillar. And the data we're using, which is kind of typical of these data, divide that up into three kind of components. So we're mostly interested in the environmental pillar today, so like measures of resource use, right, which are like water, energy, environmental supply chain, environmental innovation, which is probably very subjective to measure, but refer to kind of like innovative products of different kinds that maybe make some step change in the environment. And then basically like emissions itself in terms of carbon, waste, and so forth. So the kind of like, these are like the pillars. There's a social pillar, refers to like workforce, human rights, community, and product safety. And then there's kind of classic corporate governance thing, which refers to kind of like stuff that the corporate governance code cares about, like boards and committees, but also here kind of puts in this ESG reporting. See down there. And basically also kind of like whether companies have an explicit CSR strategy and so forth, right? So I won't go through that. We have like OECD countries with a lot of companies, about 6,000 companies in our sample. And what do we find? I hope we can read this. I can't really read it on the screen, so forgive me if I look up here. But we try to just put here, maybe at the bottom, you can kind of like see that the environmental dimension of CSR, it kind of, companies are adopting more environmental measures over time. The score, there's like a trend in the world to like being, companies becoming greener. Probably not surprising. We see some kind of like increase over time. And here we just kind of looked at Japan's also kind of increasing, but we put around Japan compared to the OECD average. Yes, that is the number one, which means it's exactly average to the OECD, right? So we see, just in the recent time, Japan very slightly pulling ahead of the OECD average. So it kind of seems like kind of middle of the road, like not bad, not good. I think Japanese tend to compare themselves a lot to the USA, in which Japanese companies are much greener than American companies, which are really like low, right? So I can say this because I'm American. I'm American, and I should now, I think, from this year on, start every talk I give by apologizing for my fellow citizens for inflicting certain things on the world. So we see environmental, looks kind of okay, not too exciting story. We're going to add a little bit to this in the next slide, but I'll just very quickly show through. I was kind of surprised in the social dimension. There's also this kind of trend of increase, but Japan, it turns out, is quite like lagging behind the OECD average, which is like probably not our main topic today, but is very kind of focused that why Japan, although it's kind of very this like long-term employment and everything, and certainly good in certain aspects like that we would admire as Americans, but for example on gender diversity or international human rights are actually not very good. So we'll come back to that. But just to say Japan is low, but still better than the United States, right? Right, a little bit better. And the governance dimension, Japan is pretty middle of the road here. I won't spend really much further time on this because the corporate governance reform, there's like much more homogeneity in how companies look like on this dimension compared to the bigger diversity in the environmental and social dimension. So that's kind of rough strategy, but we kind of said, well, is this just maybe due to like other factors like the sectoral composition or size of companies? So we did a little like fancy estimation that I'm going to go over, but just to kind of like say, well, what if we compare companies of the same size, same financial performance, the same sector of the economy, and kind of try to take that out and quantify like the kind of, what's like the Japan effect on these things, right? so that we don't get caught by the fallacy of composition that a certain country has a lot of oil companies or a lot of, or doesn't have them. That's affecting their kind of score. And I won't go in that, but just to say, Japan is, I need probably one of these pointers, but I didn't have time to fix the font on this graphic. But Japan's kind of there, right? So we said it was kind of average, but the Japan effect is actually a little bit of like a minus, right? So Japan is not the lowest country, the US, which is definitely like a big penalty for being US, but it's kind of like among the kind of low. I'm not really concerned here. There's a zone of error in these estimations, so I'm not concerned on here of like a precise ranking. But if we say, okay, there's like France, Spain, Italy are quite like leaders. There's a kind of a big middle, and Japan is really kind of in the rather lower middle, right? And if you do the same thing for the social dimension, Japan actually comes to the bottom. There's a huge Japan penalty, like even worse than the US, right? If you kind of take it for these factors. Governance, Japan is also very low. There seems to be a Japan penalty. If it's of interest to you, you can like talk in the Q&A. You can kind of like try to break this down on the different dimensions. Green means actually, that like Japan's doing better. So this is like trying to just pick a few countries and look about like what's driving those differences a little bit more. So you see actually Japan, Germany it's like a minus on emissions. I probably should maybe flip the signs on this, but it basically means Japan is like better on emissions than Germany, not higher on emissions, but better on the score. Yeah. So, Japan's not doing too bad on there, but on like the resource use, they tend to be not kind of falling behind maybe all that plastic stuff that you get in the convenience store. I don't know, but so anyway, we can kind of try to go into that and break it down a little bit further. But the story, and then I'll kind of go to the more qualitative part shortly, is that when you kind of look at Japan, well, it sort of doesn't really fit to either of the stories I started out by telling you. CSR is not really much of a mirror, and it's also not much of a substitute. So in Japan, we don't really have very strong civil society organizations. We don't have very strong like trade unions like in Scandinavia or to Germany in some extent that are kind of like using their power in the company to really promote CSR. You pretty much have a fairly passive labor force, and managers kind of do what they think at the top, maybe a little bit encouraged by government. This will come through in the interviews, that they seem to respond to all this like campaigns, actually quite a lot, are very important for companies, and they like to respond for better or worse to these issues. So despite that we think of Japan as being coordinated and being very employee-oriented, but the way in which Japanese companies are employee-oriented doesn't really seem to lead to like promoting a lot of, say, gender diversity in the workplace, caring for human rights and the external supply chain, and unfortunately doesn't really like do much to really help the kind of like environmental practices in the organization, right? So we don't really have a very strong mirror effect. Have a little bit maybe more in the environmental dimension actually than the other ones. And at the same time, the kind of strength of what we call the substitution effect is a bit weak. We'll kind of show in the next part that a lot of the reason companies are adopting, if you ask the managers, what they're doing, they'll really say like, oh, it's because the investors want it, right? And the investors are acting. And I'll try to explain to you that the way in which like the CSR department is very much close to the public relations department, which then has become the investor relations department. So a lot of the kind of driver, also some quantitative studies I have in an extra slide, I didn't do that myself, but the kind of ESG adoption is very much like driven by the share of the foreign shareholders, right, who are interested in this business case part, right? But we also kind of know that although that's important in Japan, like foreign investor power is it's kind of medium or weak. It doesn't apply to a lot of companies and so forth. There are not a lot of like hostile takeovers or things. So there's a little bit more of this kind of substitution channel and this business case, but effect here is not like as strong as say in the UK, or we have very like organized investors that are really pressuring, what are you doing on your ESG? That's happening, but just I think in Japan at a smaller scale. So just one more last point on the quantitative part before I go on. Whenever I talk about to get at this greenwashing issue, when I talk about CSR, I always like to talk about irresponsible practices of companies, because I had a kind of revelation the first time I worked with ESG data, that especially in the United States, the environmental score of companies is like strongly and positively correlated to the environmental damage that the companies are doing. So you think like we like to think like, Gregory, either he's a good person or he's like a bad person. And if he's a good person, he can't be a bad person, right? Which means like if you're good, it means you do no harm, right? But in the world of this data, we have to think of shades of gray, right? Of like high moral ambiguity, because like the biggest polluting companies tend to adopt the most policies and programs and and things on the side. So we try to kind of look at this, like, because I would say, like, if we want to know if is the CSR they're adopting effective, then we should say it should eliminate the bad behavior, and you should get to a negative correlation between the two, rather than a positive one, right? It turns out when I tried to do this for Japan, I'm not going to report it, there's kind of like zero correlation. It seemed kind of like to be not helping or hindering. But a kind of interesting, little bit nicer story about Japan is we look at, so the data gives like data on so-called controversies, which are basically mirror the CSR dimension, and we'll look, is there like a scandal report? So if I spill oil in the ocean, I'm getting like a tick for the bad behavior, or if someone reports in the newspaper, oh, there's a human rights, child labor violation in Uniqlo, or something somewhere in the supply chain or so forth, getting like a tick. We call it a controversy. It's not like necessarily a smoking gun illegal behavior, but it's a kind of an indicator. And basically we see the story here is that Japan, although it's about like average for the number of controversies over time, but when we do our fancy like correction, we see actually Japan actually gets quite, it's like the second to lowest there. It gets quite so we want to not have controversies, right? So a negative score is good. So there's quite a Japan bonus, right? That actually Japanese companies seem to be quite a lot more ethical, or at least avoiding scandals than you would expect based on their size and their industry and so forth. So that's a little bit of a thing. Here we look at like the odds that, compared to other countries of adopting, and US companies or British companies much more likely to be doing this like good behavior and bad behavior at the same time. So I thought that's kind of, we can also go into the type of controversies in Japan. Again, my mentor, Ronald Dorr, he always would say, like, I don't know, this quote might actually be from Hugh Patrick, stolen by Ronald Dorr. I'm not quite sure, but it was this idea that the British manager steals from the firm to enrich themselves, and the Japanese manager lies to the public to protect the reputation of the firm, right? So if we kind of investigate a little bit into that, what kind of controversies, and mostly they're not around environmental controversies, but it's kind of interesting to see that mostly they're not kind of self-enrichment cases, they're more of this lying to the public. But we can maybe come back to that. So I have about 10 more minutes or 15 more minutes. So I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into, okay, so we've kind of established Japan as there's kind of a bit ambivalent effect. They're kind of underperforming on the doing good, but they're not doing so much bad either. So we're in some moral gray area. So, we tried to kind of say, well, how do, like companies, like the actors in the companies really experience CSR. Is this leading to somehow change that, like the way that firms are governed and the way people think about governance, and how does it kind of fit into a story of like change or not change in Japan? And kind of first kind of observation that we had, that we see, CSR is becoming much more explicit, right? It's becoming much more CSR reporting. Companies are adopting, new policies and practices in new areas. And if you kind of ask, well, why? why are you doing that? Mostly two answers that we got. And these interviews, again, I just apologize for that. Those of you who are much more into Japan research, because this is kind of a view from probably 2019, like when we did the interview. So, I was presented this at RIAT last couple of weeks ago, and people kind of didn't contradict, but I'm happy to get your views on that. But at that time, most of the interviews cite pressure either from government, like either impending regulation or these kind of campaigns that like Koizumi and others would say, and the kind of pressure of the particularly foreign institutional investors were like the kind of biggest thing. So companies adopted, tried to start professionalizing CSR in specialized departments. And, a kind of truism of organizational theory is when you do something new and you don't quite know how to do it, how should we be responsible? Like a response to uncertainty is imitation. So the Japan, they love the SDGs much more than in Germany, right? But because it's like a framework you can really show what you're doing, right? So we found that the Japanese actors are kind of a little bit obsessed with following very clear international, very explicitly international standards to kind of demonstrate these kind of and show their legitimacy. We also kind of know, though, that when you do that kind of thing, there's always a question, is that decoupled from your really business practice, right? So we'll say a little bit more. I have a lot of quotes in the slide, and I'm happy to share you. I'll try to pick out a couple, but this kind of government pressure, when Prime Minister Abe went to the UN in New York, he declared that Japanese companies will promote ESG investments. So there's been governmental pressure to get involved. It's really top down. So, there's no really law passed, but it's kind of interesting in the minds, really respond to this. We call orchestrating CSR, that the government is kind of signaling. And then after Abe spoke, then the last part of the quote, so now we get increasing inquiries from asset management companies. So Abe speaks, and then the investors say, okay, so what are you doing now, right? And they have to respond. So here's a quote from some institutional investors. Maybe I'll read the first one. ESG issues have been discussed mainly from a risk perspective. Japanese companies tend to treat ESG as something that's cost intensive. There's a cost of doing these things, but stakeholders then tend to check ESG facts and indicators as a litmus paper of the firm's going concerns. So maybe I have to explain this quote, right? So investors look at a company. So the assumption is that CSR, or being green, costs money. So if you're not doing it and you're not spending the money on that, it's a signal to the investors you don't have the money, and that your business, that you're hiding something in your, financial accounting, right? So they're looking at this very much through a kind of financial lens as a proxy for, that kind of win-win, or even just as a way to interpret shareholder value, right? So I thought that was really interesting quote. The other one just mentions this use of the standards and so forth that I mentioned. So you can kind of see the shareholder pressure, but does it affect all companies all the time? And a lot of companies we interviewed and people spoke to, they didn't really feeling this pressure that much, right? These are the very blue chip companies in Japan. But, basically, let me see. They kind of not maybe always so deeply thinking of it, and there's certainly a lot of decoupling. So I like this quote. The second one, it's not about environment, but anyway, it's around more the gender issue, where this board member, a female board member, say, I think maybe our company is rather conservative for diversity. Top management's very globally minded. They're confident to promote it, meaning in the reports in the external world. But I think middle management, maybe that's very conservative, I feel. I think usually most companies in Japan are pretty similar, right? So we get, I should have an environmental quote for today, but some of the quotations are showing this kind of like tendency to like adopt standards, but maybe not going so deep in the organization, right? So we try to think like, well, why is that? And there's a lot of like, tensions between these kind of like demand for ESG and the kind of self-understanding of the J firm, the kind of traditional Japanese company as an enterprise community. And you would think they would go together really nicely, like this long-term view, and ecology is kind of long-term view. But remember, again, the exact meaning of CSR is a kind of contested one, right? What does it really mean to be responsible? And here you can see some of these tensions manifest in things like time horizons of companies. And let me maybe read, from this slide. So I have one on here, what the managers say, and the next slide, what the investors say. Yeah, so I won't read through all of these, but maybe to pick one, corporate director, the second one. So I still suppose most investors are interested in very short-sighted, short-term business output that don't worry too much about the long-term policies and so on. What do foreign shareholders ask for? Short-term profit in near sight, not the future, just this year, next year, maximization of profit, and so forth, right? So they, in a way, it's kind of weird because the investors are like demanding these green things, but they're also demanding like more money, which is something like the managers really still want to kind of like resist. From investor perspective, let's see. Yeah, there's kind of like a dialogue here. Maybe the first quote is like, I have a manager quote on my investor slide. So let me read the first quote from the investor. He said like the time horizon for the company could be very different among industries, different countries, stages of investment. So we try to be flexible on that because fixing that time doesn't really make sense. Actually, we do encourage companies to come up with their own sort of definition of what the mid or long term was. So companies, the investors are kind of a little bit trying to engage in like a dialogue to understand these time horizons and so forth, but there's a lot of conflicts still, which I think are maybe in this last quote to show where that maybe doesn't always align. It's basically a company that builds houses, yes? I won't say which company it is, but it says, but keeping one house as long as possible is ecological, so customers can repair or remodel their house, but building Japanese houses has been in the past short term. If Japanese houses are old, they have no value at all. But for our company, we try to make their houses valuable, right? So it's obviously kind of more profitable to bulldoze and build a new one rather than like fixing up and trying to extend the asset life, right? And this guy was kind of explaining how this business strategy kind of conflicts to what the shareholders actually want. So they like sustainability talk, but why don't you? And maybe there's one. Where was the last quote I wanted to give? Yeah, maybe this is one of my favorite quotes on this conflict, and then I'll kind of try to get to the conclusions. But this is from one of our CEO interviews, and it was a really great interview, and was talking about trying to do like good for society, but the reaction of shareholders to that. And he said the best example could be that our company revised prices of our merchandise in the previous term, For revising the prices, we announced in the market that we would cut prices on 2,400 items out of the 5,600 products in total. One day when I organized an analyst meeting, the investor asked me, Mr. M, 2,400 items are not half, but it's more than 30% of the items. Why do you cut the prices and reduce profits? And his thinking on that, he says, well, our dividend policy says 30% of profit will be given to shareholders. We're making 400 billion yen of profits. So in that sense, the dividend share has been increasing every year. We're committed to our shareholders. The target figure we disclose is achieved, so we have to balance that profit, giving the return to shareholders, with support for our customers, contributing to their life. Yeah? So we talk about goods, right? We produce something good that people need, or we serve people. And the question is which one we should choose. The final value judgment will be based on the fact that when popular items come to the market, become useful in our real life. So times are tough. People need like cheaper stuff, so we just reduce the prices, and this is social responsibility, but it's a very kind of implicit one, and the investors really didn't like it. So, okay, so maybe going to some conclusions, and then we can come back to any of these points and so forth. So first part of the talk, I kind of emphasized Japan seems to be not so much a leader, as maybe lagging behind in different dimensions of CSR. And I've tried to kind of interpret, well, why is that the case, right? And we try to interpret it really in the paper, I hope I emphasized enough, as kind of reflecting out of this, like the way Japan stakeholder relationships are institutionalized, based on the kind of rather insider community, which is not traditionally like opened up so much to the outside, not so much incorporated civil societies, or like in Germany, trade unions that are like for the whole industry, right? So you have everything in the enterprise community, and that tends to kind of view the outside groups with some hostility, or is not really systematically incorporated, say, overseas employees and suppliers and kind of the community outside so much in its thinking. So, against this background, CSR kind of enters really as something from outside, something that's coming from the international sphere, from top down from the government, something that shareholders are like making companies do, and that kind of necessitates some kind of isomorphic adoption of new practices and so forth. But we see that a lot of these practices kind of, in a way, they're kind of confusing, and they have some tensions with, the kind of time horizon that we want, like how it all fits. Should we be long-term, or should we care in short-term? Should we maximize profits, or can we do some of these implicit things? And I think these like tensions, as the stock market pressures increase, are kind of slowly getting like harder for managers to really, kind of handle. So, it's not my place to say, well, what should Japan do? But at the end of a talk, you're always supposed to kind of say, maybe for discussing like policy implications or for practice, I think, Japan does still have a good like foundation and potential for this like long-term thinking, but it needs a rethink in the sense of like more democratizing the role of different stakeholders. There's a literature I didn't really mention on like multi-stakeholder agreements and the idea of like companies like coordinating their CSR activity and like coming to like private governance arrangements that do involve outside groups, NGOs and trade unions in Europe, very important. I'm thinking of something like the Bangladesh Accord and something on health and safety in the workplace, which Japanese companies have not been too involved in there. So I think there's kind of a lot of like, in German you say Luft nach oben, like potential to like improve. There is some kind of like good foundation, because I think these like short-term pressures are weak, and in some sense Japan should be a little bit more in this leading role to contribute to the sustainability agenda, but I'll leave that for the discussion to figure out how to get there. So thanks from my side, and look forward to your questions.